What gets you out of bed in the morning? What motivates you to go to a job you may not love? Save up to buy a house or a luxury car? For most Americans, it's a desire to attain the quote-unquote good life.
It's the good life.
A great vacation starts with a great airline. It's a good life. Maybe I'll see you on the plane.
What is the good life? It's about being totally alive in every fiber, every thought, every moment.
To those who know, the good life comes from the moments you live, not the things you own.
But what if that promise that you can have the good life if you just work hard enough is a lie?
The good life.
Starting in the 1970s, the image of the good life as an economic good life started losing its traction.
Lauren Berlant is a professor of English at the University of Chicago. She spent her career theorizing and writing about finding meaning in American life, and whom our society decides gets to be included as citizens.
I mean, there's this whole question of being deserving, which I find so terrifying, was so much a part of the politicization of the good life.
Berlant says that our society and individual sense of place in the world have been shattered in the last few decades, but she wants to find a way to reshape things.
You know, insofar as I work with art and work with theory, my interest is in trying to produce better ways of thinking about what a good life would be that didn't depend on achievement and success and these kind of very beef jerky-like models of how people live.
From the University of Chicago, this is Big Brains, a podcast about pioneering research and pivotal breakthroughs that are reshaping our world. On this episode, Lauren Berlant and the cruel optimism of the good life. I'm your host, Paul Rand. What does it mean to belong in America? Who gets included in society and who gets excluded? How do we find meaning in this experience? These are questions that Berlant has been asking her entire life.
My grandparents on my father's side were communists from Russia, and my grandparents on my mother's side were bourgeois nationalists and Zionists, and they ran guns for the Israelis. So there was a lot of citizenship talk in the family, and I was 11 in 68. So I came into kind of adult-y consciousness, political consciousness, during a period when people were really fighting about it. And so there was just a lot of that kind of conversation. And I think it really matters if you're coming up during a time of movement culture.
The first books Berlant wrote were called her National Sentimentality Trilogy. They grappled with questions like, what are the relationships and responsibilities that we have to each other? And how are those bonds formed?
Thinking about belonging and attachment to life and the attachment to living on, how one lives on, has been incredibly important to me. You know, some people think they're attached to each other because of the way the law makes a web of constancy among them. So we're all citizens. What does that mean? A few years ago, a student and I taught a class called Queer Arts After Stonewall.
Today marks 50 years since the start of riots at the Stonewall Inn in New York City. A police raid led to a backlash that fueled the modern-day gay rights movement.
And when we were getting to thinking about the AIDS quilt.
At first light of day, a quilt, a dark reminder of AIDS and its victims, was unfurled, each panel representing a death.
And, you know, it was unrolled in front of the Washington Monument, and there was a lot of citizenship talk during AIDS and ACT UP. And, you know, just the way there was in the 60s, who owns the flag? Who does the flag describe? What does it mean to have an administration that actually wants you to die, that is actually enjoying the death of a population?
All the other health crises in the world, everybody rallied around. We're being ignored.
And I said to my students, for how many of you is citizenship a salient category? One. A migrant citizen. And for the rest of them, they had just taken it for granted. It wasn't a big thing then for them.
Were they surprised by their answer?
I was completely surprised by their answer, but surprised in the way that I had to just berate myself that I shouldn't be surprised. So you can imagine that contemporary students people who grew up during Occupy.
Occupy Wall Street was a social movement against income inequality, corporate greed, and the influence of big business in politics, spreading to hundreds of cities across America.
People who are starting to think again about, what does it mean to be a public? When I was doing my early work, the question of what a public was so important. And then there was a long period, like the last decade, where everyone's like, there's no such thing as a general public, which is related to there's no such thing as a purple America. And I think Obama basically emptied the bottle on the model of citizenship is a kind of meta-category that makes all of us have something in common with each other.
What do you mean he emptied the bottle?
Well, he said there's no red America or blue America, there's purple America.
Even as we speak, there are those who are preparing to divide us. The spin masters, the negative ad peddlers, who embrace the politics of anything goes. Well, I say to them tonight, there is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America.
And now everyone's like, where's purple America? Now, my first 3 books were about national sentimentality, e.g. purple America.
Okay.
You know, the idea that there was some common space that people thought was more or less a fact of a common space. And even if you had different affective relations to it, like you might hate it or you might like it, you saw that you were attached to it. Where everybody because everybody is holding the same songs or the same images or the same fantasies, they have something in common with each other. I think that's been pretty shattered. So we're living without national sentimentality for the first time since the 19th century, maybe the late 18th century.
Right now we're not.
Right now.
And tell me what you mean more by that. We're living without national sentimentality.
We're living without a normative sense that to be American means to have something in common with other people who are members of the set.
And we don't have that anymore.
I think it's been completely wrecked. And that's one of the great effects, by which I don't mean one of the good effects, of the current administration.
Democrats produce mobs, Republicans produce jobs.
Increasingly, we Americans occupy alternate universes.
But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
That is asking the question again of, you might be here, you might be in the same space as me, but it doesn't mean we both belong to this space.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
And the Ministry of Cruelty, or whoever makes his decisions, has decided to float the idea of giving up birthright citizenship. You know, to me, that's just a kind of astonishing moment in dialing back what constitutes belonging, that you have to earn belonging now, that it's not something that you show up for. And it has to be fought for, because you can see the incredible vulnerability of people who don't have it as a protection. And I think it's a really big question now. What are our names for the thing that we hold in common?
One of the forces driving the breakdown of the bonds that hold our society together is a concept Berlant calls cruel optimism. But it's not at all the kind of optimism that you're thinking of. That's after the break.
Capitalism is the engine of prosperity.
Actually, it sows the seeds of its own demise.
Could both be right? I'm Kate Waldock from Georgetown University.
And I'm Luigi Zingales from the University of Chicago.
We're the hosts of Capitalism, a podcast about what's working in capitalism today.
And most importantly, what isn't.
We're going to share the sort of irreverent banter you'd hear between economists at a bar.
That is, if economists were to go to a bar.
Subscribe to Capitalism. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts.
So you had a book that came out, and the title was this concept around cruel optimism, which is a really, in some ways, cynical point of view, somewhat disheartening point of view as I read more about it. And I'm sure that, and I don't,
everyone says that, you know, about me. In some ways, I'm so surprised by it.
And tell me, tell me what you mean by it, and why are you surprised that that's how I interpret it?
So cruel optimism is when you're attached to objects or object worlds or forms of life that fundamentally get in the way of the attachment you brought to them and of the optimism you brought to them.
Okay.
So for me, it's a heartbreak. It's not cynical.
It is a heartbreak.
It's a heartbreak that the world isn't worth our attachment to it. That it gives us objects or ways of life or forms of life that are constantly betraying us. The easiest example of this is a broken heart. So you saw in another person, or you saw in your family, or you saw in your kids, or you saw in some form of kinship, the possibility of a kind of mutuality and staying attached to the world. And then when that doesn't lasts 30 years or when it only lasts 2 weeks or when you realize you haven't fundamentally been recognized in a way that you can bear. The fear is that when you lose that relation, you would lose your world. If you break a pencil, you don't say, I'll never write again. But when your heart breaks, you say, like, I don't know if I can go on. I don't know if I can bear more loss.
Okay.
And right now we have the problem of the kind of capitalist betrayal of people's sense that there would be continuity and there would always be upward mobility.
10 years ago, I was a high school dropout, broke and deeply in debt. Today, I'm a millionaire.
Get rich with real estate, the program all America's talking about.
It's pretty simple. You work hard, you create your own luck, and you gotta believe anything is possible.
That was the American dream, right?
That was the American dream, but also just the concept of the good life itself. Like, is the world set up for me to actually not only not drown in life, but also add up to something? So people are trained to think that what they're doing ought to matter, that they ought to matter, and that if they show up to life in a certain way, they'll be appreciated for the ways they show up in life, that life will have loyalty to them, their job will have loyalty to them, or their intimates will have loyalty to them, or their dog will have, I mean, I know so many people who have just given up and are now completely obsessed by their pets because work and love and life aren't producing the kind of loyalty that dogs are bred for example. Yeah, now I'm just thinking about people and their dogs. I'm a cat person, you know.
And I'm sitting here thinking about my dog.
Exactly,
so yeah.
right. So, and I've worked at this university for 35 years.
Okay.
So for me, my job was the thing that was going to produce continuity for me in the world. But let's say I hated my job, or let's say it turns out that living for work is not really a good idea. And working to live would be a better idea. Well, but I think, in fact, capitalist structurations of subjectivity suggest that ambition is all about trying to better yourself and trying to better your lot and there are all of these concepts of upward mobility that organize our sense of life. And so the argument of cruel optimism is that starting in the 1970s, the image of the good life as an economic good life started losing its traction.
Okay, but it was real before then, is what you're saying.
I'm not saying it was real, it was better. What happened is people started selling off public goods to private ownership.
Okay.
That really matters. And then the notion of the entrepreneurial subject was invented, and the notions of human capital became dominant in certain fields. And the idea that, you could game the system, you as an individual could game the system, rather than what happened in the Depression and the long period also after World War II, which is the idea that everybody's boat could float, even though there would still be inequality.
Right.
But what starts happening is that the sense that you're on your own, that the gradual diminution of the Great Society and the New Deal model of social accountability
is gone.
Gone.
It is 1932, and the American economy is sick. But America's new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, has a plan.
Soon after taking office, Roosevelt made it clear that he would be president of all the people, including those at the bottom of the economic ladder.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
He causes the government to borrow vast sums of money, which it uses to put people back to work. He reforms the banking system, polices the stock market. He builds the Social Security system, guaranteeing people they will never retire into poverty.
Before Social Security was passed, old people just died. And you were your family's responsibility. If your family had stuff or they liked you, you might not die right away.
Right.
And then suddenly people who weren't in production were taken care of if they participated in the economy at all or not. I mean, it's amazing. You can't imagine that getting passed now. So the post-war period, the exceptional post-war period, between the 40s and the 70s, where the GI Bill, I mean, if you just think about the effects on American society of the GI Bill, it's kind of astonishing.
The GI Bill promised World War II vets a raft of benefits.
If they can't find you a job right away, you'll be given $20 a week up to a limit of 52 weeks. The government pays all of your school bills up to $500 a year, and living expenses of $50 a month. Or $75 a month if you have dependents.
And now people would say, did you earn it? Did you deserve it? I mean, there's this whole question of being deserving, which I find so terrifying, was so much a part of the politicization of the good life. I mean, you remember George Bush I saying, 1,000 points of light, the idea of a volunteer society became so important in the United States. And that's incredibly depressing. The idea that everybody who's generating value and reproducing life shouldn't be able to survive and more than survive. I mean, one of the things that happens in this model of entrepreneurial subjectivity is that survival looks like the best possible horizon of living.
Right.
And
which is not very appealing.
Right. And survivalist success, it's so terrible that people's best creative energy is sucked up trying not to drown. Those questions, which are material questions. What will you do if you lose your job? What will you do if you're 60 and real estate has just gotten too crazy? How are you going to live? If the policymakers of the society have already sold you out because they think that profit should be held by capitalists, then the world doesn't exist for you. And then we're back in the 1920s and the 1910s and before that.
If you're listening to Big Brains, there's a good chance you consider yourself a lifelong learner. However, you may not know about the University of Chicago's Graham School and its focus on continuing liberal and professional studies. For more than a century, Graham has been a destination for lifelong learners. They offer courses online and in the classroom, bringing the transformative education UChicago is known for to students of all ages. To learn more about the courses, certificates, and degrees, visit graham.uchicago.edu. What do you do when you've lost your sense of belonging, when there's no public for you to belong to, and the world you thought was promised to you turns out to be an illusion? Understanding these concepts shines a whole new light on President Trump and even the 2020 election.
I don't think that the Obama election did anything but to amplify the rage that people who thought that life would come to them if they showed up for work and if they showed up for each other. However local.
But it didn't deliver.
But it didn't deliver. And it was already not delivering for a lot of people. I mean, if you think about Appalachia or you think about Detroit or you think about, but I remember sitting at the Starbucks on 53rd Street in Hyde Park when Obama got elected and all the people like sitting around going, this is going to be our time. And it wasn't just African American people thinking that, it was also youth thinking that. It was also people who thought that there was still a chance for there to be a genuinely redistributive administration. And then, of course, it turned out that he had drunk the neoliberal Kool-Aid when he was at the University of Chicago, and he really did believe in entrepreneurial subjectivity and people responsibilizing upward mobility. And he would go and say that to people, and I'd just like, yeah, there are no jobs. And there's, that joke about like the Obama recovery was really great. I should know I have 3 of those jobs. This idea that he was going to return the United States to a space where there was an everyone who would benefit from the vast wealth that is here was very quickly trashed, and that's what the Obama administration and then made possible to lead to the Trump administration, where it became very clear that it was going to be a culture of my sovereignty or yours, okay, and my people, my base, or yours, and I could see that that white people especially were like dying to just stop being politically correct, stop feeling shamed, and to blame somebody for the fact that like their good faith showing up to life wasn't being rewarded. And meanwhile, you had Hillary Clinton and the neoliberal Democrats saying, we're going to do a little for you. We're going to see if we can try to help. There was nothing inspiring about that. Right. I mean, when she said that, I thought, and now Kamala Harris says that. Right. I'm just going to do what I can. And we're going to govern with what's possible. And then Elizabeth Warren says, why would you bother running for president if you're just going to do what's possible, meaning what's probable? That what you have on his side is a kind of radical freedom. Let's reimagine the world. And meanwhile,
you have cruel optimism as to what he's promising?
Well, it's my view, but I'm not objective about it. It's my view that people who thought that he was going to bring jobs back, right, and people who thought that that they were a public that he had a commitment to, are going to have been very disappointed. I mean, right, because he's a showman. He goes to Indiana and says, "I'm saving your jobs," and then the jobs leave anyway. Right, and he goes to coal country and says, "I'm going to save your jobs," and then the jobs leave anyway. But on the other stand, he still represents an affective freedom, and so affective citizenship, he has delivered on that.
So I don't pick up you as necessarily being traditionally political in a sense. But if you were going to give political advice and you're saying, listen, you got Kamala Harris saying this, you've got others saying this, which you don't think is going to resonate, what's the antidote to this? And if you were going to be giving advice saying this is what got us to this point, what is the answer to get us out of this?
Wow. So I read a piece about John Kerry that talked about his inauthenticity with respect to himself. You know, he was the person who said, who wants to be the last person to die in an unjust war? And then by the time he's a candidate, he's like saying, I'm showing up for service. Okay,
Right.
so he totally disavowed his like left political positions. And people can smell that. People can smell self-betrayal. Okay. So one thing is...
That's an interesting word, self-betrayal, isn't it, in this case? Yeah.
Well, I thought it was.
Yeah.
But also, who's he kidding? So, in fact, I have this whole... I'm writing a book on humorlessness after the next book, and I have a chapter on comb-over subjectivity. And I never thought we'd have a president with a comb-over. And the thing is, we're all comb-over subjects, which is to say, there are things about us that don't make any sense that we hope no one will call us on.
Okay.
And the comb-over is kind of... So, and that was a comb-over moment for Kerry. He didn't want to... And everyone knew he had that vulnerability, and they totally exploited it.
Yep.
But like this is about Kamala Harris. Like I think she could. She's somebody who is really good when she's against someone.
Yes.
But she stands for nothing. So the thing is, I feel like you have to have something you would die for. You have to have something that people really believe that you would actually be willing to be exposed about. And you know, with Trump, it's cruelty. So on the other side, what would you be willing to be exposed about?
Give me an example of what that could possibly be.
So, for example, universalizing citizenship, like whatever kind of law would follow from that.
Okay.
The people who are here already generating value, who are producing life, do have a general amnesty.
Got it.
That seems like really important to me because people are already holding up the world together in the old-fashioned sense of there is a general society. And Andrew Yang has his version of that, which is the
universal basic income. That's running through my head at the same time.
That's
yeah.
right. And that sounds too scary to people because the people who have been working thinking other people are going to get stuff without
doing
working.
nothing. Right.
But they're not doing nothing. They're raising children. They're having families. They're participating in the community in all sorts of ways. But right now, we don't really trust the people who aren't doing whatever it is we were told we had to submit to in order to be able to constitute ourselves as productive members of society. So that would be a good example. But I think generally, we're going to have to think about whether we have a general public or not. So the question of who is responsible, and whether it's the family who's responsible and this increased normativity of the family, or whether we still have an image of the state as a necessary provider of goods and resources, is really what's at stake right now. And I think should be at stake for the Democrats, but your mileage may vary.
So do you think this is healable?
Well, it was destroyable. So in my lifetime, the model of an increasingly inclusive citizenship was a value that motivated people. And then in my lifetime, it's been totally trashed. Mm-hmm. In my lifetime, women were transformed from having only patriarchal control over their bodies to having more and more kind of respect in the workplace and also respect, legal dignity, let's say, is a technical term for it. And in a minute, it gets trashed. But the fact that you can see that there would be a build, I'm all about the build. How are we going to build it? What's the relation between the small gestures that one could do toward building? And this is where the more moderate Democrats, they could still say they were trying to build something visionary and then say, like, here's how I would do it. I would do this thing first and then that thing first. It's the Ruth Bader Ginsburg model of feminism, which is she wasn't interested in a general emancipation. She was going to do this thing and that thing, and then she was going to see the weakness in the system.
Right.
So my optimism is, it's changed in my lifetime, it could change again. I guess my pessimism is that the cruelty has released effectively so much rage at the sense that other people are stealing the good life from oneself, that I don't, which is another way of talking about anti-PC, that I don't know how you get the anger back into the bottle. I don't know. The thing that produced the idea of a general progress in a general public world, it didn't come from rage, it came from some sense of inclusivity as one of the models of being American, and it was still struggled against. I mean, the New Deal, all the Republicans have wanted to do since the passage of the New Deal is to try to destroy it. So we have to have a long-term project, and we don't have one, partly because the Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter kind of gave into the neoliberal model of, well, maybe we should have corporate-public partnerships. And in the end, the logic of the corporate won. So how do you break the property concept that has organized your sense of belonging to the world? So my argument there is that you have to break analogies, because a lot of the ways we build the world is to make this is like this, and this is like this, and this is like this. And then you could just start refusing analogies, right? Like you say, well, actually, it's not like this. Like there's a normativity to the kinds of connections that you make. I'm interested in like the rhetorical question and the kind of the politics of refusing the rhetorical question. Because someone will often say, well, why? Like Milton Friedman would say, why would we give the state the opportunity to organize our lives? The state is like the worst possible institution for organizing our lives. And he thought it was a rhetorical question. And it isn't. You could say, oh, for these 10,000 reasons. And then you would have to have the argument. You break normativity by refusing its right to ask a rhetorical question. You break normativity by refusing its sense that we know what the evidence of democracy is, because we can put different objects near it. And that's a thing that I think is just so important about why scholarship matters and why scholarship in the humanities matters and why just experimental thought matters, is the way you break something isn't to just find a better object. It's to loosen up the object and transform it from within itself. And so what we have to do kind of as artists and writers and teachers is to ask the question, are there other concepts of the good life that would be more satisfying than the ones that you have been trained to pay attention to?
Big Brains is a production of the U Chicago Podcast Network. If you like what you heard, please give us a review and a rating. Our show is hosted by Paul M. Rand and produced by me, Matt Hodat. Thanks for listening.